Okay, this one's a little complicated, but follow with me, watch the diagrams, and hopefully it'll all make sense to you. The basic rule is ein bishul achar bishul. There is no cooking after cooking. And if what we're not allowed to do is cook, that means if there is no cooking after cooking, then cooking after cooking is allowed, because it's not considered cooking. So once something is already cooked, then you're allowed to cook it again on Shabbat. However, what we're going to learn right now is that there are many exceptions. So this rule actually only applies in certain circumstances. Hopefully by the end of this lesson, you'll be able to see what those circumstances are. Let's start with this. Ein bishul achar bishul. Under the right circumstances, you can put cold food into a hot place, which would normally be considered cooking, or into a hot food, which would also be normally considered cooking. But of course, this is only if what you're putting in is already cooked. We're going to learn that there are many details to this rule, and that's what we're going to be discussing right now. First, let's examine the source of the heat. If the food is on the fire, and now you want to add something which is cold that has been cooked onto that food on the fire, you are not allowed to do it. And the reason is because it looks like cooking. So even if it may not actually be cooking, it's prohibited because it looks like cooking, and the people around you will think that you are cooking on Shabbat, and that would not be allowed. So any of the rules we're going to apply, ein bishul achar bishul, cannot apply when the object is actually on the fire. There is one small exception, and that is to put something on top of a pot, which is on the fire, let's say on a plate, in order to heat it up, but we're not going to discuss that right now. The second possibility, which is where all of our discussion is going to be, is where it's possible for the food to be cooked, but it's not on the fire. What would some examples of that be? Kli rishon, which we learned about in another video, which is off the fire, or iroi from kli rishon, and in certain circumstances, even kli sheni would be considered that you're able to cook there, and these are the circumstances where we will apply the law of ein bishul achar bishul, because you are able to cook, it is able to be cooked, but since the object that we're putting in has already been cooked, therefore we say ein bishul achar bishul, and it would be allowed to be done. Now, any place where it's too cold to be cooked, for example, a kli shlishi, there we do not even apply the rule of ein bishul achar bishul, because you're allowed to do it anyhow. Because there's no cooking on a kli shlishi, and therefore it's permissible, and we don't have to apply the rule of ein bishul achar bishul. So far we've learned that the first area that we need to be concerned with is the source of the heat. If it's on the fire, it's prohibited because it looks like cooking. If it's too cold, we don't need ein bishul achar bishul. Only in circumstances where it can cook, but it's off the fire, do we apply the rule of ein bishul achar bishul. Now we're going to look at the state of the food that is being cooked. If the food is completely raw, then obviously we're not applying the rule of ein bishul achar bishul, because it's raw, and therefore if it can be cooked, it will be cooked, and it is prohibited, not allowed. So we must be talking about food which has been cooked already. Now, even for food that has been cooked already, certain circumstances it's allowed, and certain ones it's not allowed. Let's see how it was cooked. If it was baked, which we refer to as afia, then you're not allowed to do it, because even though we say ein bishul achar bishul, however, we do say yesh afia, yesh bishul achar afia. There is cooking after baking, which means to say, for example, if you want to take a piece of bread and put it into boiling hot soup, which is either kli rishon off the fire or iroi of kli rishon, or according to certain circumstances, even a kli sheni, you would not be allowed to put that bread in because it's considered bishul, because it had only been baked, it was only afiyah, v'yesh bishul achar afiyah. So therefore we must be talking about a case where the food that we're trying to put in was cooked, was bishul, either boiled, fried, or roasted, all of which we refer to as bishul. Now, even if those categories are correct, in other words, it's cooked food that had a story of bishul, where it had been boiled, fried, or roasted, nonetheless, we need to find out what kind of food. If it's a liquid, again, it will depend. If it's a solid, it will depend. The rules of liquid is that the whole reason why we cook a liquid to begin with is to make it hot. Therefore, if the liquid has been completely cooled off, we say that yesh bishul achar bishul by putting this liquid into a boiling hot situation, whether it's into another food or whether it's into some other situation where it can cook again, by heating it up, it's as if we are cooking it. However, if the liquid remained warm, and therefore we're just making it hotter, then we say ein bishul achar bishul, and it is allowed, and that's why it's a green box, not a red box. Now, when it comes to solid foods, there are certain foods which we refer to as soluble, which means that they are able to melt very easily into whatever you're putting it in. For example, sugar, instant coffee, or instant soup. In all of these cases, even though we are taking a solid and putting it into a heat circumstance, nonetheless, and that solid has been cooked already, nonetheless, we would say that since it's soluble, since it melts easily into what you're putting it into, we would say that yesh bishul achar bishul, you are not allowed to do it. It is prohibited. That's why it's in a red box. However, if it's non-soluble, some examples might be meat, vegetables, pasta. In all of those circumstances, if it has been cooked already, it may be added to another food, which even if it's a kli rishon, which would normally be cooking, because we apply the rule of ein bishul achar bishul. So to make it simple, there are 5 basic things we need to pay attention to see whether we can apply the rule of ein bishul achar bishul. The first is the source of the fire. The second is the state of the object that we're putting into the heat. The third is what had been done to it to begin with. The fourth is what kind of food is it. And finally are the factors that we need to pay attention to. And ultimately it turns out that only in 2 circumstances, either a warm liquid or a non-soluble solid, do we apply the rule of ein bishul achar bishul. And even then, only if it had been cooked and not baked. Obviously, it had to have been cooked, and it cannot be on the fire. If it's on the fire, then it would be not allowed for other reasons. I hope this made a very complicated subject a little bit easier to understand.